Is this our last big project of the year except for the post-Senate cleanups?
Good morning. Today is Tuesday, April 7th. House Ways and Means Committee, I'm going to answer questions, Carolyn. It's 10 a.m. We are diving in deep on H 955 today and for the rest of the week. We have a vote warned, I think. We're going to warn a vote for Friday morning. And we have a lot to do in the meantime. There is not much on the floor for this week, but we are not planning to go to the floor this week. So if you have a reason that doesn't work for you, again, please let me know. Our agenda just looks the same every day. And we're going to sort of go through this piece by piece as best we can. We have a lot of separate components that we have been working on up until this point. And tomorrow morning, the staff is going to put them all together and we're going to look at it all together as one package. We've been putting that off because they can't all edit simultaneously once it's all in one document. But it's also hard to keep all the pieces in mind if they're in separate documents. So we'll do that tomorrow morning. Planning to work on this week. And then support its work in appropriations and on the floor. In terms of the work we have left before us, in the brief period we'll have between when this bill leaves us and another bill and then comes back to us, we are going to probably starting on April 15th, we're going to do some work on progressive income tax brackets and ways we might want to change our income tax brackets. And developing a committee bill based on that. And then any bills we receive from the Senate, we'll take a look at. We have not really received very many thus far. S220, we're going to integrate testimony for that into this week. Because the ideas in it are an important part of the conversation. But given that it's the only Senate bill we have, it will probably stay on the wall for a little while because that's a nice thing to do. And I think those are all my public service announcements. So, we're going to start today by looking at school construction language that John put together based on sort of all of the different components that we've taken testimony on in separate pieces. And so it lays out some like sort of immediately actionable work and some much longer term still to be determined work, as has been the case with any of the education transformation work we've done. So, John. And there's, I don't know if you remember, but last week when we looked at the map from House Ed, Beth said that they weren't quite finished, and the finished maps are on our committee page for today, just because they had to be posted somewhere. We're not going to look at them today, probably.
Has the language changed, or it's just the
language? The maps didn't match up with the language, and the maps now match up with the language. Also hoping that tomorrow when we look at the complete bill, we can look at a timeline as well, so that all the different pieces can slot into a complete picture. I'm now going to stop talking, John. And you can start.
I like to not talk. Good morning,
Wrong job.
everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I will screen share. These are, as the chair signaled, it's a standalone set of provisions, or as Kirby described it, some wayward language on school construction. Fairly large. You got 18 pages here. So I'm going to go fairly slowly, so I'm happy to questions as they come up. So will be plopped into the larger amendment, and section 1 expresses a findings and intent section that is specific to these school construction provisions. So this is for the full, sometimes you see an intent section that's for the full breadth of a bill, right? These are findings and intent sections that speak exclusively to the state aid piece. So starting with findings, the General Assembly finds that 1, much of Vermont school facilities portfolio is at or near the end of its useful life and will require substantial investment to address deferred maintenance and other necessary updates. School facilities assessments conducted pursuant to Act 72 of 2021 identified over $6 billion in total needs over a 21-year period, with an average annual need of $300 million just to achieve replacement in kind. These needs have only grown since their estimation in 2023. 2, under Vermont's current education finance system, school construction expenditures are paid from the education fund and apply pressure to property taxes. While non-property tax revenues support a share of education fund expenditures, property tax revenues make up the bulk of the ed fund and are expected to make up an even larger share as ed fund expenditures outpace growth in non-property tax revenues. I think you guys have seen slides on that. 3, although school construction decision-making is controlled at the local level, the costs of that decision-making are spread across all property taxpayers in Vermont. A school district's decision to bond for a school construction project increases both the district's homestead property tax rate and the property tax rates of school districts across Vermont. 4, Vermont's school budgeting process asks school districts and property taxpayers to weigh operating expenditures against capital expenditures within the same budgetary constraints. So long as both costs are borne by the property tax, school districts are disincentivized from taking on school construction projects. Certain communities in Vermont may struggle to support even necessary school construction expenditures. 5, the foundation formula created in Act 73 did not provide funding for additional capital investment in school facilities unless additional revenue sources are utilized or an alternative financing model identified. New school construction projects will continue to be funded from the ed fund and will continue to apply pressure to property taxpayers across Vermont. So this is setting up the framing for taking a position on trying to provide a source of funding for state aid for school construction.
I was wondering if we could add the thought there that it also applies pressure within a school district to prioritize. It could force school district to prioritize repayment of bond over regular provision of education.
So I think that
Classroom.
a finding seems like a more objective thing and intent seems more.
Sure. Yeah, findings you do want to back up with facts, but I would just say, I think the concern you're trying to get at is actually captured in 4 rather than in 5, which is identifying that the budgeting process does put operating expenditures against capital expenditures. So it's trying to identify in a broad factual way that school districts do have to make a choice between, because they're competing for the same limited pool of funds, that at times folks are choosing between their educational expenses and a capital expense, basically.
We talk about taxpayers, call them out specifically in number 5, but we really don't talk about students or children in there. And I just,
In the findings.
and maybe it could then be more specifically, called out in 4. But it impacts that, and I just think we should, this, as they say,
Highlight the needs of children.
name it.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I can think about that. I will say that sometimes findings are frustrating to lay folk because when I draft these, I do try to draft them in like the most minimal form that could be supported by someone or to ask what the factual basis. So something like saying that the budgeting process asks for these things to happen doesn't say what the impact on people is, but we can make an inference that it does create a particular impact, but it refrains from stating what that impact is without having the empirical basis to support it. But that said, I can think about it. I'm just saying that these are drafted in a way that is intentionally minimal. That makes sense.
And maybe our intent and sort of having our intent focused around children.
Nice to
would be
have.
nice, but we haven't gotten to the intent yet, so let's do that.
Okay, so that is next. Bottom of page 2, starting on line 13, it is the intent of the General Assembly to create greater scale, increase the efficiency of the delivery of education services, and encourage the efficient use of funds by prioritizing school construction projects that align with the creation of the new school governance structures expressed in this act. So just recall that while you're seeing this as a standalone set of provisions, this is being dropped into that broader amendment. So it's pulling in what is contemplated for new school governance structures elsewhere in the act, page 955. Intent of the General Assembly to address inequities in education funding across the state and remove disincentives to the construction of necessary and educationally appropriate school facilities by offering state aid in the form or forms best suited to a school district's local context and needs. On page 3, recognize the urgency and opportunity offered by Vermont's education transformation as expressed in this act, and at 73, by identifying alternative models for funding school construction. And there's a little bit of shift when we go to 4 through 6. These are speaking much more explicitly to specific funding vision that you're going to see in this draft. So 4, in the short term, catalyze the state aid for school construction program by providing state aid in the form of up to an additional $50 million. And I wasn't sure what the dollar figure here is. I know that we heard some discussions when I think it was Sean Baker was in from the treasurer's office. But I have a provisional figure here.
I think it's actually 100.
An additional 100.
Additional 50 to 100, I think.
What?
I think it was an additional 50 per year to the existing bonding. Which was 50, so it was 100 total.
So that,
So I heard that once and then I heard 100 additional another time.
So
yeah,
it's, I've heard multiple times, 50 plus 50, 50 already.
Okay.
so
I'll check with them.
I heard we could do an additional 50 up to 100 and then later clarify 96 or something like that. 86.
Okay.
Yeah. So we should figure out what that number should be,
Okay.
but somewhere in that range, it sounds like there's additional state bonding capacity available that will not hurt the state's credit rating.
Can we keep that number colored,
Yes.
highlighted?
Color melody.
So in the short term, catalyze the state aid program by providing state aid in the form of up to an additional some dollar figure amount annually in state bonding capacity to support the construction of regional high schools or other projects that result in the consolidation of school governance structures. That's one string. 5, in the long term, provide state aid in the form of a debt service subsidy to school districts pursuing school construction projects that align with the goals of the state aid for school construction program by leveraging the capacities of the Vermont Bond Bank. So that's things like consolidating across multiple districts, the financing and building together multiple bonds for going out to market. And then also, I think, using the state intercept model. So this is just saying, in the long term, provide a debt service subsidy, leverage the Vermont Bond Bank when you do this. And 6, throughout Vermont's education transformation, provide state aid through multiple funding streams until the burden on property taxpayers imposed by school construction expenditures can be reduced. So as a whole, what these are saying is, this is a short-term proposal. Here's a long-term proposal. But during this transitionary phase, you might see multiple forms of state aid going out.
2 things. And number 5.
Mhm.
What this is just intent, but what if there were another source of bonding? It wouldn't have to be through the treasurer's office. It could also be the Vermont Bond Bank, excuse me. It could also be if they have another
Sure.
source. So
And this,
should we say that?
I think one of the, from my perspective, one of the ways that this is a program, rather than money, is that the districts need to really work very closely to meet the goals of the program. And one of the sort of checks and balances built into that is actually the bond bank's process, so that the whole thing is kept together. I think if districts want to bond somewhere else, then they don't need this. They're not going through this program. They're doing a different thing. So in the case of Winooski, which worked really, really well to do the USDA bonding, they wouldn't need the state to be interfering in that because they have a even better deal that they can get elsewhere.
Then I would compliment. If this is more of a program, then we have to allow places that didn't use the bond bank because it wasn't available and the program wasn't available to have taken out their bonding through a different method.
To be clear, this doesn't prohibit anyone from bonding in different ways. This is just expressing intent as to the form of the aid that would be offered. But it's not restricting the methods by which you might.
So you could still, clear, you could still be part of this program. If before the program started, you bonded not with the bond bank.
This is intent.
If this doesn't,
No force of law.
Okay, fine.
but
Yeah, well, I don't know.
So do you want to make sure that Burlington is included in things in the future? Yeah, of course, as you should.
And
Yes,
then
I'm just being
number
explicit about it.
Number two,
Bridget, was yours about number one?
I'm sorry.
You probably got number two.
Yes,
Okay.
mine was still about number one. I just, my question was for John later in the language, because I haven't gotten all the way through the language yet this morning. Do we talk about what we're gonna do with folks who bonded beforehand or who bond outside of the program? Are they still gonna be eligible for some kind of, I was just asking essentially pure question in a different way, which is, I know this is our intent, but are we gonna cover all those other folks that might not bond through the bond bank or might find other ways? Are they gonna be eligible for assistance with principal and interest repayments in some way later in the language?
so I don't have any new language that speaks to the legacy debt question, which I think part of what you're getting
Yeah.
at. We do have included here for discussion, the existing legacy debt provision that this committee has seen before. So there's nothing about this that would preclude that section from offering aid to districts regardless of who they used to bond. And I would say more broadly, I don't think the expression of intent here is to say, to dictate a really narrow path for folks to go out of. So in the future, let's say that someone, so we talked about legacy debt. In the future, if someone goes out to bond, they aren't precluded from accessing this program by not leveraging the bond bank. There's nothing in statute to prohibit that.
I just want to make sure that the language here and then the language on the foundation formula, when we get there, when we talk about that later, we sort of marries up so that if we're specifying very narrowly like what, how we're calculating or how we're assuming we're going to calculate the foundation formula, that we're making sure that districts have a path outside of the foundation formula to fund
Sure.
all of this stuff.
And we will come to a piece at the very end of the bill that's related to supplemental district spending.
Okay.
So I think that'll help address.
And oh, you have your part two. Go for it.
In number two, here, we talk about inequities in funding across the state, remove disincentives in a form that's best suited to school districts, local context and needs. And here's where I really think, what question that pops up for me is, what do we do about removal of PCBs in a building that's about to be renovated or in a building that's about to be torn down?
Yep.
The state saw that that was a need in a particular school district, and they were able to say, we will pay for the removal of PCBs, well, for the destruction, whatever, removal of them, and then getting them to another place, because it costs a lot of money to put them there. And I just think everybody in the state should have the same exact benefit as
So
that benefit.
I'm going to ask you to hold that question because it feels a little bit in the weeds, and see if by the time we get to the end of the bill, if you think it's met or not.
All right, and one more thing.
Yes, and I'm also going to ask everyone to, I think it's helpful for us to do the whole bill and then go back and edit it from there. But
And just
what's your other
findings, it was $300
and
million.
I'm not trying to get you to not say
No,
the
no,
thing.
no.
I just want
$300 million for placement in kind. Does that mean with
What?
the
Mhm.
beginning, it
Yes.
said it's gonna cost $300 million yearly, or whatever it is,
Yep.
for replacement in kind. So are you imagining all the school buildings that currently exist? Because we don't have a plan for consolidating and making it fewer school buildings? Or what are you?
Yep, the point of this first paragraph is to say that in recent years, the state received a facilities assessment that indicated a pretty large number, 300 million annually over this 21-year period, right? And that figure is likely an underestimate of the amount of funding that would be required to achieve Vermont's vision for education facilities, because that number, which is from years ago and doesn't reflect increase in cost since then and changes in standards, also only reflects replacement in kind. So it's not moving school districts to 21st century educational standards. That's really why that is called out. The other practical thing I would say here is I am supposed to be in Senate Economic Development at 11. I can potentially, we can figure out if I can push that back some, but I did just want to note that.
So let's go through all the language, and then we'll go back through a second time. This is gonna be the language. In trying to prepare for this, sort of went through the components and which ones we're gonna need to go through 4 times and which ones we probably only need 1 more go at. And this was the piece of language that probably we're gonna need the most goes at. My deeply technical explanation. So let's do it. This is sort of our first round.
Perfect. So we will jump to section 2, which is on page 3. This is a creation of positions in the Agency of Education for the School Construction Division. So the following permanent classified positions, and I will say I wasn't actually sure what language to use there, but I think that's what is likely appropriate. The following permanent classified positions are created at AOE. These are drawn from the AOE's recommendations for the positions that it requested in response to the Act 73 reports. 1 school construction program director, 1 financial manager 1 school construction coordinator, and 1 architectural design reviewer or educational facility planner. I will note that the AOE's request didn't specify how many of this last reviewer or planner and seemed to contemplate that there might be more than 1. But at the very least, this would achieve the minimal amount that AOE requested. Under subsection B, the Secretary of Education shall include as part of the agency's budget submitted to the governor for FY28 a request to provide appropriate funding levels for those positions and any other positions necessary, so they could say that we need an additional facility planner to staff the school construction division of the agency. The division shall provide comprehensive technical assistance to the agency and the State Aid for School Construction Advisory Board on the implementation of the State Aid for School Construction Program. So section 2 here is just creating a set of positions to fully staff up, is the hope, the school construction division with this rollout of the program. Section 3 is to try to accelerate the rulemaking process for school construction. Just as some background, you'll know that Act 73 transferred the authority for rulemaking from the state board to the AOE. And so the AOE will receive July 1 of this summer a set of school construction rules that have been in existence for some time. So they're going to need to amend those or add additional rules. And this is saying on or before the end of this year, there's a question of achievability. AOE, in consultation with the advisory board, shall adopt rules on school construction and capital outlay, including rules to address 1, prioritization and bonus incentives that A, support the creation of regional high schools or other projects that result in the consolidation of school governance structures. B, direct greater construction aid to school districts with lesser wealth as measured by the aggregate equalized education property tax grand list of its municipal members per weighted long-term membership. And 2, the treatment of school districts' outstanding capital indebtedness as of December 31st, 2025. I'll pause there before I jump to B. So broadly adopt rules on school construction and then provide some specific pieces that require addressing. We've talked a bunch of times last year and some this year about prioritization and bonus incentives. This is the chance for the legislature to weigh in on how the projects will be directed, essentially. And so the 2 that are called out here are 1, aligning with, and we'll come to the section of the State Aid chapter, with this vision for regional high schools resulting from voluntary mergers under the Act, and priorities and bonus incentives to provide aid in proportion to And then also to directly address how to deal with that outstanding capital indebtedness. You could add more things here, but these are the rules. The subsection B is saying to try to accelerate the timeline, adopt these rules as an emergency rule and currently propose them as a permanent rule. It's deemed to meet the standard for the adoption of emergency rules under the Administrative Procedure Chapter.
Would love for folks to be tracking places in this bill where we're gonna need rulemaking and like on paper or your computer, and ways that we want to be as specific as possible with legislative intent related to that rulemaking.
I 100% support the idea of weighting construction aid in some way. I wonder, because in my county, property values are driven by job density and proximity to job sheds, and they're running ahead of salaries. And there are surrounding towns that are, I would argue, probably perceived as having lower properties, but may actually have more capacity to pay than might be indicated. I wonder if we could spend a little time talking about what the best measure is of capacity.
And I think that sounds great. And I think Rhode Island has some mix of income and grand list value. Yeah,
I think that's right.
Yeah,
More.
yeah. So yes, absolutely.
Otherwise,
Yep.
we're gonna be at that.
Absolutely. And I think we were sort of trying to match the supplemental district spending, but it makes more sense in the context of supplemental district spending because you're actually talking about something relevant to grand list. So
And I
Yeah.
assume when you're talking about this, are you talking about this going into effect before a foundation plan? Because if it's going into effect, then we have to talk about weighted long-term membership, because that's hugely problematic.
Are the bonus incentives, are those set by? Is that a term of art?
Yeah, it's built out in the program, but it is built out in rule. We don't actually have specificity in statute as to what the bonus incentives are, but it's basically, you can think of it as there's a minimum, you may recall in the Act 73 draft, 20 to 40, right? 20 to 40% aid available, 20% is your base amount, and the bonus incentives are like the incremental
Right, okay, yes.
pieces that take you up to the cap.
Pretty common in other state formulas too.
Section 4, this is for the advisory board to identify regional high schools and rehabilitation opportunities. So on or before, December 1st this year, the advisory board shall provide a written report to the General Assembly that 1, identifies opportunities for the construction of regional high schools and rehabilitation of existing school facilities that align with the creation of new government structures under this act. You're going to hear that phrase a number of times today, trying to pull together the pieces in this bill. 2, provides a full siting study for each identified school construction project that includes the cost, location, and any other factor that the board deems relevant to the General Assembly's consideration of that project. And 3, analyzes the compatibility of each identified school construction project with the other projects, evaluates different statewide scenarios for pursuing multiple opportunities for consolidation across Vermont. So that's included because you can imagine a report that identifies opportunities for regional high schools. They might not all fit together, right? And so this is saying, identify the opportunities, provide a siting study for each, and then provide kind of a statewide scenario that would consider those in the aggregate. And then subsection B, in developing the board's report, the board shall specifically consider to achieve the greatest scale possible and how to achieve regional comprehensive high schools integrated CTE. This is highlighted green because I heard a little additional direction on what should be included here, but could not track down the underlying language to support that. So that's mainly just a call out for me to know that this is something to, this is a place where you can include factors for the advisory board to consider as it makes these recommendations.
I have concerns with the greatest scale possible because there's a U shape, there's a horseshoe on scale. And so I think just striving for scale without consideration of other factors could actually be more expensive and worse for
if
public.
you want to,
And then the
you
other,
want to think about a sentence that is sort of meets that intent, but doesn't go on forever, could you bring it back this afternoon?
try. And then the other is comprehensive high schools has a very specific definition and it has implications for funding that go far beyond regional high schools. And so if we're going to put that in here, that is something we need to weigh in the context of the funding formula.
So I think in both cases, it's we're trying to achieve sort of the intent of the best scale possible and not that technical term. So if you can wordsmith that, Rebecca, and bring it back, that would be great.
So you do not want, I think we have to have a larger. I don't know what you're trying to achieve here. So I can't, it's honestly, when you talk about regional high school means something very different than comprehensive high school with integrated CTE. And has implications for how we talk about CTE. And we need to do some work around CTE, but frankly, there's been no coherent plan put out that addresses this need right now. So
So you're saying we can't do that?
I'm not saying you can't, I'm just saying we need to understand the implications of the language we choose. That has implications. In Vermont, if you are a comprehensive high school, you are allowed to charge tuition as if every single one of your students is a CTE student. And I don't,
Yeah.
and so it has implications.
Okay.
I want to make sure we get through the whole thing. So, and that's green for obvious reasons.
Yeah, and I will just say the green is indicative that I really wasn't sure how best to capture what. Yeah. So this is even more provisional than other first draft language. Section 5, this is now jumping to the state aid for school construction chapter that was amended dramatically by Act 73. Right, so last year, Act 73 included this statement of policy. You know, you see that in now subsection A. And the new language that is added in subsection B is intended to tie together with the intent language that you saw about different funding streams in the short term and the long term. So that's what you see at the bottom of the page and bleeding on to page 7. Subsection B is to further the intent of this chapter to prioritize school construction projects that align with the creation of new school governance structures under legislation and act. And you're going to hear this call out because we're now amending the green books rather than operating within session law. In session law, I can say this act, right? Because it's referencing the act within which it's situated. In the green books, I can't do that. So align with the creation of new school governance structures under legislation enacted by the General Assembly in 2026 that requires each school board to participate on a school study committee to study the advisability, forming a unified union school district. That's the long way that we call out this act. It's the intent of this chapter to leverage additional state bonding capacity to support the construction of these projects while the state identifies the total school construction need to be supported by state aid offered under this chapter. So again, linking back to that intent language for funding streams. The other piece I would note here that matters more than you might typically think for intent language is that the statement of policy, this language is pulled into and cabins the discretion for rulemaking. So the rulemaking does have to take into consideration this. On page 7, section 6 is just a small tweak related to the state bonding that is being proposed here. So this is section 3442 of Title 16 and sets out the AOE's responsibilities under the state aid program. I've included a call out in 2 just to show the language for adopting rules, but there is no proposed change there. It's full context. But the new language that you see, it's in subdivision 3, including as part of its budget submitted to the governor, its annual school construction funding request, including any projects contemplated under the statement of policy language that we just talked about for funding through state bonding. So linking a bunch of things together here as possible. So this is saying submit the budget and make sure that you call out those that are to be supported by state bonding. In any event, those would need to be included in the capital budget request as well. On page 8, this is a tweak to the advisory board. So you see a change to the composition. The board shall be composed of the following 9 members, so the addition of 1 new member, 5 members who shall serve as ex officio members, state treasurer, BGS, Vermont Bond Bank, chair of the State Board of Education, and lastly, the school construction program director of the Agency of Education. I would offer 2 thoughts here. One is I did not include or designee like is included for any of the others.
Yes.
For the sense that this is meant to be intentionally this specific person. And the other piece I would call out, which came up in discussions last year, and I don't think is actually a huge deal, but this is a board that is advising the AOE. So this would include as one of the members, someone from AOE advising the AOE. On page 9, I don't think you technically have to have this update to subsection E, but the board shall have the administrative, technical, and legal assistance of the Agency of Education and the agency's school construction division. So this is trying to make clear, you'll recall when I talked about the new positions created to staff up that school construction division, that it was called out that they would provide aid to the advisory board. So this is again trying to cement that link in saying you have the administrative, technical, and legal assistance of the Agency of Education, and you get the school construction division within the agency. I also didn't want to make it just the school construction division because legal assistance would not come from there. Subsection G, this is just striking old language, right? This report date, this was due last December. So now you no longer need it here. Cleaning up statutes. Section 8, this is more core state aid provision. This is the big section that sets out the eligibility conditions, the application process, awards of construction aid occur. I've included a lot of language here that is untouched just for context so folks can see it, but I'm not going to talk about it. It's just there. So you're going to see what's required for a preliminary application. And then on page 10, you're going to see for the approval of preliminary applications, there's a set of considerations that have to be undertaken by the Secretary of Education. None of them are touched. And then subdivision B sets out the eligibility conditions. Again, these are untouched, but for maybe one thing. Yeah, these are untouched essentially, but I wanted folks to see them so they know what is required under the state aid program. The change that you see in subdivision 4 here.
John, just for Carol, Representative Odie's question, you did have up there the threat to school to.
Yes. Yes. So one of the eligibility conditions is that the project fulfills a need occasioned by one of these 4 things. Conditions to protect health and safety, facilities inadequate to provide legally required programs, excessive energy use, or deterioration of an existing building. So these are the sorts of things that kick you into the eligibility condition. The one thing I would flag on this front is prior to Act 73, you had to meet one of these needs, and Act 73 offered an alternative to meeting one of these 4 to try to get at this goal of achieving consolidation. Sorry, and that's what you see in subdivision 2 here. The project results in consolidation of 2 or more school buildings and will serve the educational needs of students in a more cost-effective, educationally appropriate manner. But you have to meet the rest of the eligibility conditions as well, right? Excuse me, the subdivision 4 is trying to maintain the same standard, but recognizing that you might have a newly formed school district. So one of the eligibility conditions is the applicant achieves the level of proficiency in the school district quality standards regarding facilities management adopted by rule of the agency. I just will call out, this is done by self-evaluation, right? So this is something the school districts themselves say that they are meeting those that show up in rule. And this is providing to ensure that new school districts are not prevented from accessing state aid, or if the applicant is a newly formed school district, the applicant will achieve the level of proficiency in the school district quality standards regarding facilities management adopted by rule at its initial performance evaluation under the school district standards. Otherwise, not touching any of the eligibility conditions. And like I said, the substance of this tweak is meant to maintain the same eligibility conditions, but to extend them to the school district. On page 12, this is a fairly meaningful change in the process for accessing state aid. The way that it currently works, it's currently set up in law, following approval of a preliminary application, a district must vote funds or authorize a bond for the total estimated cost of the project before any prioritization points can be assigned to that project. So the vote authorization, the bonding has to happen relatively early in the process or earlier in the process than it might happen to ensure that you can receive priority points and also so that you can receive final approval. There's a hiccup this introduces when you're contemplating dual funding streams. If you think about it, if you're saying that we're going to provide some state bonding capacity as aid to school districts, and we might also provide a debt service subsidy, you don't want the local school district to bond for the full amount of the project, right? you want state bonding to cover a portion of it, and so the school district cannot know what it needs to bond until it knows the actual amount of aid that it's going to receive, right? If you're contemplating dual funding streams. So it creates kind of a procedural hiccup and requires some modification to the ways that these things work. So that's why you see this language struck. We don't want to prevent, you're proposing not to prevent school districts from receiving prioritization points, even if they haven't voted funds or authorized a bond, because they don't yet know what the state aid is going to be. On the flip side, the downside you lose in this is that previously school districts would only be pursuing a project, right, if they're quite far along in their process. And now you might expect, I don't know if it would affect the kinds of applications that you receive, but you no longer have that check in terms of the number of applications that are going to come in. And you can imagine if you haven't voted funds or authorized a bond, and then you've had it prioritized, but then you go out to vote the funds or try to bond, you don't receive approval, well, assume it can be removed from the priority list, but it just, you can see the kinds of hurdles that arise, complications that come from having these constraints. Subdivision 4, in existing law in Act 73 proposed this request for legislative appropriation. This is to require annual construction funding requests as part of the budget cycle. And so the language updates that you see here are getting at the addition of state bond as a source for state aid. The agency shall submit its annual school construction funding request to the governor as part of its budget and shall clearly identify those projects contemplated under subsection 3440B, which is that statement of policy section, right, that had called out the intent to kind of kickstart the program through leveraging additional state bonding capacity. To clearly identify those projects for funding through state bonding, following submission of the budget and submission of the recommended capital budget, the House committees on education, on ways and means, and on corrections and institutions, and the Senate committees on education, on finance, and on institutions shall recommend a total school construction appropriation for the next fiscal year to the General Assembly. You're seeing some new committees added here, including the institutions committees, which you might expect with the inclusion of state bonding. We might imagine, I don't know, but we might imagine that this would look somewhat like the process that predated the moratorium, where 30% regularly capital construction aid or 10 million each year would go out to school construction projects and would flow through the capital bill.
Is this language going to go through that committee as well?
I do not know what will happen with the path of the language. I do know that in that I raised concerns with this was drafted about different committees' appetite to handle different pieces of this, and I know that that will be flagged or they're considered. I just don't know the actual path of it, but
So it is flagged though.
yes, as the person who drafts the capital bill, have some
Thoughts?
thoughts about how that committee might react to. That's my very
That's all.
flat way of stating it, yes. On page 13, you're going to see similar updates related to the bonding or voter authorization. So final approval for construction aid currently requires, and you see this in subdivision B, that you've received preliminary approval, that you've voted funds or authorized the bond for the total estimated cost of the projects, that you've made arrangements for project construction supervision, et cetera. 2 has been struck for the reasons that we just discussed. I did want to flag that depending on, you may have to think some more about this section, because you can imagine what is the availability of making arrangements for project construction supervision by persons competent in the building trades in the absence of authorizing the project. I could see someone making an argument as to how broad arrangement should be interpreted, but I'm guessing that under the existing approach, the thought is that this is a pretty meaningful check that you've got full construction supervision. So I just want to flag some of the difficulties of thinking about what should be required at final approval if we, and maybe we have to think about another way of sequencing, like if the state signals the kind of aid that would go out, but then the district, there's going to have to be sequencing and other discussions around how to approach this. So I just wanted to identify some of the complications of of that, and at the very least, strike the requirement for full authorization. Any release of, while you would, final approval wouldn't require this, there would be no release of funds until there'd actually been authorization, which we will come to that shortly. So on page 14, this is the big change to the aid section itself, and this is the award of aid, right on line 13. The base amount of an award, I should back up a little bit. The last draft that you saw contemplated 100% coverage, right? So this is returning to something more akin to what you saw in Act 73's provisions with a range of aid available, but it's a much broader range than was contemplated there. And I'll explain a little bit of the technical changes I made here too. So the base amount of award shall fund, that's an intentional choice, 50% of the total approved cost of a project. Projects are eligible for additional bonus incentives as specified in rule to fund up to 45% of the total approved cost. So this is contemplating a range of 50 to 95%. I've switched away from using eligible debt service because in the existing language, in the existing statutory language, which isn't yet effective, we call out eligible debt service because all aid is envisioned to be in the form of a debt service subsidy. And so when we say what the total figure is, we take the ratio of the approved cost to the total cost of the project, and then we multiply that by the lifetime cost of the bond, and that tells you what your proportion of aid should be for the full cost over the lifetime. Because you're now contemplating different streams, and I wanted to avoid there being confusion as to how to apply. Let's say you get a 60% total aid package, but 30% is state bonding, 30% is debt service subsidy. I didn't want there to be any confusion that you're getting 30% of the local bonding cost that you take on, because that would be too low. You're supposed to be getting 30% of the total cost of the project. I don't specify how you would determine this, but it's not hard to figure out that you would ask how much is to be funded locally. In this case, it would be 70%, right? Because 30% is through state bonding. And then you would take 30% and divide it by 70% to give you the proportion of the local bond cost to be covered. I don't think you have to spell out any of that technicality. That's just the thinking behind it. And so the language that's used here, fund 50% of the total approved cost of the project, is meant to avoid needing to delve into those technicalities.
You got John for 10 more minutes. We need to get through this.
Well, while we get through this, I'll ask you. I'm sure you'll be back.
The subsection B, the construction aid shall be awarded as a debt service subsidy, support through state bonding, or as a combination of both. Amount shall be awarded annually or subject to an annual appropriation for the purposes of the program. You can imagine if you've taken on a long-term state bond, there's some existing obligation there in the first place, and shall be released only once the applicant has voted funds or authorized the bond for the total estimated cost of the project to be covered by the applicant. That's the place where the authorization is now included, but I do think that's a piece to be considered. As discussed, I have struck the eligible debt service cost language because now less useful for these purposes. If there's appetite to talk about the technical way in which you would calculate how much is to be covered locally, can do that, but I think it's somewhat intuitive and the sort of thing that can be done from the branch. And then C retains some of the previous language that you saw. Annual total debt service subsidies awarded under this chapter shall not exceed unspecified figure, and annual total state bonding support awarded under this chapter shall not exceed, and this will ride on whatever happens earlier in the draft, but that $50 million figure or $100 million figure, whatever it might be.
And we're gonna wait because we've only got him for a few more minutes.
Nothing touching the emergency aid section, and then I was asked 20 minutes before I came to committee to add this wage requirements piece, so I don't have much to say about it. But I hope it's relatively straightforward. Any contract awarded for school construction that is paid for with state aid shall adhere to the higher of the prevailing wage requirements established for school construction under state law, the prevailing local wage requirements as determined by federal law under the Davis-Bacon Act and related federal acts and regulations. Seems like helpful clarifying language is my best guess, because obviously these existing requirements are law, whether they're included here or not. So I think it's mainly clarified. On page 16, you've seen these pieces before, except for section 11, which I'm going to talk about. Section 9 repeals the deferred maintenance piece. As you know, there's a prohibition on extending state aid for school construction projects that result from substantial deferred maintenance, which is something to be defined in rule. I think we talked about this before. That might be the majority of school construction projects across the state. So unless you repeal this, you're likely not providing state aid to programs, depending on how that is interpreted in the rule. Something to think about. Section 10 is exactly the legacy debt aid section that you've seen before. I think this is still intentionally in the form of active committee discussion. It's 100% coverage of full outstanding indebtedness. Broad term indebtedness, right? Like we discussed before. The new piece that I wanted to hit is section 11. And it looks small, but there's a couple of big things implicit in this. So this is an amendment, future effective, with the rollout of the foundation formula to the definition of supplemental district spending. As you know, and you can see this on lines 14 through 17, there's a cap on the supplemental district spending. The voters of a school district other than their state school district shall not approve spending in excess of 5% of an unweighted student count. Of an unweighted educational opportunity payment is the way to think of it. And the new language that you see is that the cap on supplemental district spending shall not apply to school construction expenditures. So this is addressing some of the concerns folks have expressed about, could you actually fit those within the cap imposed by the supplemental district spending? The pieces I wanted to flag that are implicit in this decision are, it's never actually been resolved whether school construction would be subjected to the cap in the first instance, whether it would be a form of supplemental district spending, whether it's sourced in the same way that other education funding is sourced. So I just wanted to flag that while this seems to be addressing a technical problem that needs solving for purposes of the school construction program, and you do have time to think about this for years, I just wanted to flag that there was never an explicit decision to subject school construction to the same mechanics of other kinds of educational expenditures in the future state. And I just don't want the committee to forget and implicitly accept that through this section, basically. So just know that there's still hasn't been identified what revenue sources for school construction in the future will be, and you may develop at some point an alternative plan where you don't need this language at all. But for now, this is trying to address that specific concern. Lastly, effective dates. Most of this takes effect July 1, 2026, which is the time at which the state aid program goes online, except that supplemental district spending piece, as you can imagine, tracks the contingencies that were provided for the foundation formula rollout. I'm not going to rehash these. These track what Beth has provided elsewhere in the Act, except that because they're now situated within the Act, I don't have to make as long of a call out to 2026 bill that addresses, et cetera. And that is it. And I know there were a couple of questions that came up at the end.
Becca, you had something?
I think probably I need to sit now and put it together with what you put at the very end. I guess my question was, I assume the first part here is being written for the now, but also for the future under the foundation plan.
Yes.
And here, hypothetically, let's just take, I won't pick on Charlie's district, but let's say you take a district that is already bumping on the excess spending. It's probably going to have significant cuts under the foundation plan. So you're probably not going to have a lot of capacity to spend beyond, let's say even 95% total of your project was covered. It's going to be tough to get that 5%. Is the assumption here that you get it off of private fundraising? Like, how are people supposed to pay for that?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. But you did see these trying to at least address the cap imposed by the supplemental district
Well,
spending.
then the second question is, why are these folks restricted to some sub% of the total cost, whereas the people who've already voted are going to get 100% reimbursement?
Not a question for me, but yeah.
Okay, no,
yeah,
but there is a difference, right? That's one of the issues we
Yeah.
have to address.
Right, this distinguishes between previous approaches, current indebtedness and new projects, yes.
Representative Maslin.
I think it may be an obvious question, but I think you started by saying what you're proposing today is an alternative to what we've seen in previous days.
Yes,
We may very well pick through what you've drafted here, what you've drafted another day tomorrow and say, which ones do we want to choose?
sure.
I mean, it's an obvious question, but I've kind of been tracking these changes as opposed to others that have been around. See where we end up.
Yeah, as long as you guys give me the smallest number of pages, I will be happy.
And I also appreciate your, what should we call it? Necessary words, you know, not being overly
Sure.
verbose, which doesn't help some of us. So thank you very much.
Representative Moody.
Thank you. On page 10,
Mhm.
you cover a lot of important things. You don't specifically talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Is that purpose or?
So what I would say is I included this language so that the committee would have this available to know how the school construction project proceeds. But I was not asked to tweak anything other than as necessary to achieve the funding streams. So like basically the request to me was implement these, make available state bonding capacity to catalyze the program. And then what tweaks do you need to make, what minimal tweaks do you need to make to the chapter to make that possible? So that is what the drafting reflects. It's just me making it possible to achieve that. It doesn't reflect any, I certainly did not think about the eligibility conditions beyond the way that they affect ordering those pieces. I would note that this is the language that emerged from the working group and was passed just last year, but it's not to say that it reflects everything that everyone wants for school.
Okay, I don't know whether we should put it on a list or what. And then the other thing is, when you say conditions that threaten health or safety of students or employees, do you read that as security, like how many entrances and exits there are to the building and whether the building can be secured on a regular day?
So I will offer something odd in this context, but the way that I read it may not especially matter that much, which is to say that we actually have an existing rule set from the state board that will be transferred to the AOE that likely speaks to what counts for health and safety. And that's probably a good place to look is for the state board rules on school construction. And I imagine that you can find, and you'll know that there may even be like a guidebook or something along those lines, because I know that there had been a pretty fulsome process years ago to 8 districts going through. And it may also speak to your ADA question.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks, John.
Thank you.
I know it's a lot, so I expect to be back many times on this one.
Thank you for the overview.
I will be back I'll definitely be back this afternoon and I'll see if I can come back as soon as possible.
Okay.